Hello everyone, I'm Mike D'Angelo with That's Entertainment, and this is your video review of Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor by Monolith Productions. Licensed games are a tricky business for a lot of developers. Over the course of the last 3 decades, only a handful of them have been properly delivered, and even then, very few have scratched the surface of the better properties that surround them. On top of that, games based on movies, TV shows, and comics also typically have a very narrow scope that doesn't vary too far from what's been established in their particular medium. You're very rarely going to tread new ground, and when it does happen, it's incredibly risky. When the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out, Middle-earth games made a huge resurgence. There were a few decent games that preceded them. Of course, none of them had the ambition that the ones based on the movies did, but they were still restricted by the script that Peter Jackson and his team were following. Now, Shadow of Mordor has arrived, and it promises to perform its own acts within Tolkien's created world, blending new characters with established locales, characters, and lore. While some might find it blasphemous, others might find it courageous. But the real question is whether or not the game delivers.
Well, me and my lads will soon put that right.
Shadow of Mordor has the advantage of being able to rely on a huge amount of backstory and lore. Tolkien didn't mess around with his world building, and that's why Middle-earth is able to stretch so far. That this game doesn't take the easy way out and utilize the established plot lines is the most telling. Taking place in the middle area between the 2 movie trilogies allows for Mordor to have a much deeper character than what we saw in Lord of the Rings. It hasn't yet become a dreary wasteland, even though most of the earlier palettes accommodate that notion. You're dropped right in the heart of Sauron's lands, father to a murdered son and husband to a murdered wife. But you're not alone. Somehow, a wraith with some very similar circumstances has raised you, and will continue to raise you until your quest for vengeance and knowledge is complete. While the game treads its own path, there are definitely some crossovers between all the Middle-earth mediums. You'll run into Gollum at some point, and the story has a great deal to do with the Rings of Power, but it still stands on its own merit. It's only bolstered by the series it comes from. It doesn't lean on it like a crutch. Although you might think that Shadow of Mordor would find some basis in one of the plethora of Middle-earth-based games that preceded it, you'd actually discover that it leans on some of the more popular modern franchises we've grown accustomed to. Taking cues from Assassin's Creed, Batman's Arkham series, and even Rockstar's many sandbox-style games might not seem like it would work out so well for a Tolkien property, but it does surprisingly well for itself. The development team was made up of a good deal of industry experts, who use their knowledge and experience to craft a game that isn't hindered by its license. While the game starts off a little quickly and expects you to slide right into the thick of things, over time you learn the input and combat becomes quite fluid. With some 300-esque slow motion, Talion's battles against the Uruks, orcs, and other beasts are the kind of epics that the bards would gladly sing of. You can take the fight to your foes in several different ways as well. Talion has several weapons at his disposal, including a sword, which he does most of his melee fighting with, a bow that he uses for long-range attacks, and a dagger that serves as the basis for his stealth attacks. A combination of all 3 is what makes him a lethal fighting machine. But that doesn't mean that all of his foes are pushovers. While the majority of the inhabitants near Mount Doom can be dispatched with a handful of sword blows, Uruk captains and war chiefs serve as much more than just fodder. Luckily, Talion's ethereal companion lends some fantastic powers that give him the edge. Shadow of Mordor is also bolstered by several upgrade systems. Harvesting herbs, finding treasures, and killing enemies raise experience points as well as Miriam, which are used to unlock both abilities and runes on Talion's weapons. But to reach new levels of abilities, you need to slay those pesky captains or interrupt certain events in Mordor to gain power points. The one place that Shadow of Mordor suffers a little bit is in its presentation. The game most definitely has the next-gen filter of dreary browns and grays. To some extent, it works for the sake of its setting, but you can see that a lot of what's on screen was not given the rigorous attention that a lot of the other games of this generation have put into their titles. That said, the Wrath world has a bit more personality, and combat feels fresh and lively, even as you're introducing orcs and uruks to their deaths. The slow motion lends a great bit of power to the presentation, and you'd be at odds to find another game that made you feel as badass as you cut down hordes of your foes. The sound, on the other hand, impresses throughout, with epic orchestral music that calls back to the movie franchise, and sound that really places you in Mordor. You have no other choice but to commend the developer for a job well done. Add to that the surprisingly impressive voice work from some of the industry's greatest actors, and you've got a recipe for amazement.
years ago.
Let's take a moment to talk about the Nemesis System. One of the things that really sets Shadow of Mordor aside from a lot of other games is the long-reaching artificial intelligence. The Uruk captains aren't simply thrown into the game willy-nilly. They understand how you're assaulting them, and they'll adjust their tactics over the course of the game. If they survive, they'll remember your treatment of them and seek vengeance, or call you out on your failures. In this way, the game feels that much more lifelike than many other games of our generation. That is, of course, only one of the things that can stretch this game on for a mighty long time. The way that you advance Talion's skills are another huge component of the game. While the twin upgrade systems are kind of simplistic in their nature, I can't fault the developer for them, since the Nemesis system is so impressive. And while Shadow of Mordor doesn't have a proper multiplayer mode, you can still take up the cause for the other players who have fallen to the captains of Mordor. It's almost like the Souls game in some regards. Despite a prestigious franchise to fall back on, Shadow of Mordor consistently stands proud. It isn't adverse to treading new ground, and it leaves its mark on both the player and Middle-earth, confidently promising more. In a lot of ways, this game succeeds in places where no other licensed game has before. It doesn't just reach the bar that's been set before, in a lot of ways it surpasses it. And while Tolkien might have been a little skeptical of the choices that were made with his world, I'm sure even he would agree that this is the closest a game has come to reaching his level of genius. That's Entertainment awards Shadow of Mordor a score of 9 out of 10.